The final bolt screeched in protest before surrendering with a satisfying thunk. I wiped a smear of grease and sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, leaving a triumphant stain on my skin. There. Done. It stood before me on the unnaturally green expanse of my front lawn, a 7-foot-tall testament to 3 months of obsessive planning, late-night 3D modeling, and a brief, fiery affair with a MIG welder that had cost me my left eyebrow for a week. I called her the Zephyr's Whisper. To the untrained eye, or more accurately, the perpetually unimpressed eye of anyone else living in the soul-crushingly beige landscape of Maple Creek Estates, it was probably just a bunch of shiny metal. But to me, it was art. It was a symphony in stainless steel. A series of 7 interlocking, polished rings and impossibly thin, curved blades, all balanced on a central axis with the precision of a Swiss watch. The ball bearings were ceramic, silent, and frictionless. The slightest puff of wind would set the whole thing in motion, the rings counter-rotating, the blades slicing through the air in a silent, hypnotic dance. It was my splash of glorious metallic chaos in a sea of HOA-approved taupe conformity. My masterpiece, my rebellion against the tyranny of perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. For a full 10 minutes, I just stood there, admiring my work. The late afternoon sun caught the polished surfaces, not with a blinding glare, but with a soft, diffused glow that seemed to make the whole structure breathe. A gentle breeze, the kind that usually just rustled the leaves on the meticulously pruned maple trees lining our street, whispered through the blades. The sculpture began to turn. Slowly, gracefully, it came to life, spinning without a sound, a silent dervish on my lawn. It was perfect, absolutely, undeniably perfect. And then, of course, I heard the telltale click of a neighboring screen door. My perfection, it turned out, had a shelf life of about 11 minutes. I knew who it was without even looking. You develop a 6th sense for these things when you live next door to Carol Peterson. It's a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure, a faint disturbance in the force, as if a million joys were suddenly silenced. I turned, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. There she stood, on her side of the immaculate, ruler-straight property line, her arms crossed so tightly she looked like she was trying to give herself a hug. Carol was the self-appointed queen of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association, a woman whose entire personality seemed to be a collection of passive-aggressive Post-it notes brought to life. She wore a pastel pink tracksuit that was probably worth more than my car, and peered at my creation over the top of her glasses, her mouth a thin, disapproving line. "Frank," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth, like a text-to-speech program set to judgmental. "That thing." Her eyes flicked from the sculpture to me, then back again, as if trying to comprehend how 2 such offensive objects could exist in such close proximity. "It's a kinetic wind sculpture," I said, my voice full of a pride that I knew, even as I was speaking, was entirely wasted on her. "Isn't she a beauty? I call her the Zephyr's Whisper." Carol's expression didn't change. "It's very large." 7 feet, I confirmed proudly. "Custom fabricated." "And shiny," she added, as if this were a profound character flaw. "The sun glinted off it this morning and woke up my cat, Bartholomew. He was very distressed." I paused, trying to process this information. Bartholomew was a 20-pound ball of fur and malice who spent his days sleeping and his nights plotting the downfall of the local bird population. The idea of him being distressed by anything less than a disruption in his food supply was laughable. My internal monologue was already screaming. Oh no, not Bartholomew, the famously fragile emotional state of that fat, furry brick. Did he need therapy? A safe space? Should I offer to pay for his counseling? Outwardly, I kept my cool. Oh, sorry to hear that, Carol. The finish is actually brushed steel. It's designed to diffuse light, not reflect it. It should be fine once you, and Bartholomew, get used to it. Was all she said. It was a sound freighted with 1,000 unspoken complaints. She gave the sculpture one last withering look, the kind a mob boss might give a witness right before they're fitted for a pair of concrete shoes, and then turned and marched back into her house. The screen door clicked shut behind her with an air of finality. I should have known that wasn't the end of it. With Carol, a is never just a It's the prelude to a war. The declaration of that war arrived the next afternoon. It wasn't delivered by a herald or an emissary. It was delivered via Scotch tape. There, stuck to the center of my front door, was a single, pristinely white sheet of paper, protected from the elements by a plastic laminate sleeve. It was a letter. A typed letter. I peeled it off the door. The lamination was thick, professional grade. She'd clearly put some thought into this. The font was Times New Roman, size 12. The universal font of bureaucratic soullessness. I read it aloud in a dramatic whisper, savoring the sheer, unadulterated audacity of it all. Dear Frank, I began, I am writing to formally express my concern regarding the recent installation on your front lawn. While I appreciate the desire for personal expression, the metallic monstrosity currently residing at 124 Maple Drive is becoming a significant neighborhood disturbance. Monstrosity? She called my whisper a monstrosity? I had to sit down on my porch steps. This was better than I could have imagined. Firstly, the constant, unpredictable movement is distracting to drivers passing by. Secondly, despite your assurances, it creates a faint but persistent whirring sound that disrupts the natural peace and tranquility of my backyard Zen garden. A whirring sound. The bearings were ceramic. A feather falling on cotton makes more noise. Her Zen garden consisted of 3 rocks and a plastic flamingo she thought was an ibis. The only thing disrupting the tranquility back there was Bartholomew trying to dig up her petunias. Furthermore, I believe this installation violates the spirit, if not the precise letter, of HOA Bylaw 7.4.c, which states, all non-standard lawn fixtures must be of a reasonable size and aesthetic, and must not detract from the harmonious visual continuity of the neighborhood. This thing is neither reasonable nor harmonious. She'd cited bylaws. Oh, this was serious. She'd gone full legal. I trust you will understand my position and will take the appropriate action to remove the offending object for the sake of neighborhood tranquility. Sincerely, Carol Peterson, 122 Maple Drive. I read it again, and a third time. My initial amusement was slowly curdling into a hot, simmering rage. It wasn't about the light. It wasn't about a non-existent sound. It was about control. It was about the fact that I had dared to introduce something unique, something I loved, into her world of beige sameness. She hadn't just insulted my art. She had dismissed it. She called it a useless thing. And that's when the seed was planted. That evening, I was slumped on the couch, rereading the laminated letter for the 10th time, marveling at the perfectly centered text and the sheer passive-aggressive energy radiating from the page. I was stewing, pacing. My mind was a whirlwind of angry, sarcastic retorts I should have made. "Oh, I'm sorry, Carol. Is my art interfering with your cat's intensive nap schedule?" To distract myself, I put on some random documentary about renewable energy. Something about wind farms in Denmark. On the screen, giant, elegant turbines spun against a cloudy sky, turning the wind into power. I glanced out my living room window. In the dusky light, the Zephyr's whisper was turning, its polished steel catching the last rays of the sun. The blades moved with a steady, relentless grace. It was a beautiful, powerful motion. My eyes drifted from the TV to my sculpture, then down to the letter still clutched in my hand. The words echoed in my head, a mocking refrain from Carol's flat, nasal voice. Offending object. Metallic monstrosity. A faint but persistent whirring sound. But one word stood out from the rest. The word she hadn't written, but had implied with every fiber of her being. Useless. She thought my beautiful, elegant, silent piece of kinetic art was useless. A pointless lawn ornament, an oversized pinwheel, a whirring, shiny nuisance with no purpose other than to annoy her and her emotionally fragile cat. A slow, mischievous grin spread across my face, the kind of grin a cartoon villain gets right before he unveils his ridiculously elaborate plan. An idea, fully formed and shockingly petty, bloomed in the fertile soil of my anger. It was stupid. It was childish. It was excessive. It was perfect. My internal monologue, which had been sulking in a corner, suddenly sat up, put on a lab coat, and started cackling maniacally. "Useless, huh, Carol?" I muttered to the empty room. "Challenge accepted. If you think it's a nuisance now, just wait until it has a purpose." The problem with brilliant, spite-fueled ideas is that they often require skills you don't actually possess. I'm a graphic designer. I can make a logo pop, and I know my way around Photoshop, but I couldn't tell a DC generator from a car battery. My brief, fiery tango with a welder to build the sculpture had taught me one thing. I was very good at making sparks, and very bad at creating structurally sound metal joints. If I was going to turn the Zephyr's whisper into a weapon of mass irritation, I was going to need help. I couldn't exactly call a mainstream electrical company. "Hi, yes, I'd like to weaponize my lawn art against my neighbor. Do you do that?" I needed someone flexible. Someone who operated in the glorious gray area between professional engineering and backyard tinkering. My search led me to the shadier corners of the internet, past the slick corporate websites, and into the murky depths of local community forums. Tucked between an ad for a used couch and a desperate plea for a lost parakeet, I found it. A simple, no-frills post that read, "Gus's Odd Jobs and Creative Engineering. If it's weird, I'm in. No questions asked, mostly." It was perfect. 2 days later, a beat-up Ford F-150 that looked like it had personally survived the apocalypse rumbled up to my curb and shuddered to a halt. A man who perfectly matched the truck's aesthetic climbed out. He was a burly guy in his 50s, wearing grease-stained overalls over a flannel shirt, with a magnificent, walrus-like mustache that seemed to contain its own gravitational pull. This had to be Gus. He ambled up my driveway, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag. He didn't say hello. He just stopped, stared at the Zephyr's whisper for a solid minute, then turned his gaze to me. "So," I began, trying to sound like a normal, sane person and not a man on the verge of a suburban holy war, "the idea is to hook this up to a generator." Gus continued to stare at the sculpture, his head cocked to one side. He squinted, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. Then he looked at me, then back at the sculpture. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You want to take that shiny, spinny thingamajig and strap a lawnmower engine to it?" "Not a lawnmower engine," I corrected him quickly. "A proper DC generator, something quiet. I want to generate power for, green energy. Saving the planet." I tried to inject a note of noble, eco-conscious sincerity into my voice. Gus's eyes narrowed. He looked past me, towards Carol's house. She was, as if on cue, peering through her blinds, her silhouette a perfect portrait of suspicion. His gaze flickered back to me, and a slow, knowing grin spread across his face, making his mustache twitch. "Green energy," he repeated, savoring the words. "Right. This wouldn't have anything to do with the lady next door who looks like she's trying to set my truck on fire with her mind, would it?" I felt my cheeks flush. "My motivations are multifaceted." Gus let out a loud, booming laugh that startled a nearby squirrel. "Kid, I don't care if your motivation is to power a small hospital or just to annoy the hell out of Prissy Polly over there. The job's the same. And this," he said, gesturing towards my sculpture with a greasy thumb, "is the weirdest damn thing I've been asked to work on all year. I love it." He stuck out a massive, calloused hand. "Gus, my consulting fee is a case of cold beer, and you let me order whatever weird parts I need off the internet without asking too many questions." "Frank," I said, shaking his hand. It felt like grabbing a handful of wrenches. "You've got a deal." The unholy alliance was formed. What followed was a masterclass in chaotic engineering. If our project was a symphony, Gus was the conductor. I was the terrified first violinist, and our orchestra was a bizarre collection of mismatched parts, ordered from sketchy websites based in countries I couldn't pronounce. The build became a montage of mayhem, a series of comedic disasters played out on the stage of my front lawn. First came the gearbox. Gus found what he claimed was a real beaut on an online surplus auction. "It's from a 1980s golf cart," he announced proudly when the greasy 20-pound hunk of metal arrived. "Top of the line, for its time." We spent an entire afternoon trying to mount it to the base of the sculpture. The moment we got it hooked up and a breeze kicked in, the gearbox sprang to life with a sound I can only describe as 1,000 dying cats being put through a wood chipper. It was a horrifying metallic shriek that echoed down the street. We both froze, looking towards Carol's house. The blinds snapped shut. "Okay," Gus whispered, frantically trying to disengage the gears. "Plan B. Maybe not the golf cart one." We had a frantic, whispered argument right there in the driveway, me gesturing wildly, and Gus stroking his mustache, completely unfazed. Next, we needed a foundation for the generator itself. "Gotta be level," Gus declared. "Can't have her vibrating all over the place." So we decided to pour a small concrete slab behind a conveniently located azalea bush. How hard could it be? The answer, it turns out, is very. We messed up the water-to-concrete ratio. What was supposed to be a smooth, professional-looking pad ended up as a lumpy, gray monstrosity that looked like a cowpat from a concrete cow. Gus said, poking it with a stick. "We'll call it rustic." The wiring was a battle of wills. I, the meticulous graphic designer, envisioned clean, buried lines. I had diagrams. I wanted it to look seamless, professional. Gus, the pragmatist, held up a giant 100-foot bright orange extension cord. "What's wrong with this?" he asked, genuinely confused. "It's insulated." We compromised. We dug a trench. Or rather, I dug a trench while Gus supervised, offering helpful advice like, "Watch out for that root." It was a shallow, lumpy, winding scar across my lawn that tragically intersected with my wife's prize-winning petunias. We laid the cable, buried it, and were left with a raised, wiggly line of dirt that looked like a massive earthworm had tried to tunnel its way to freedom. My wife was not pleased. Through it all, Gus and I formed an unlikely bond. We'd sit on the porch steps at the end of the day, drinking the beers from his consulting fee, admiring our lumpy, noisy, poorly wired creation. He'd offer me terrible life advice. The secret to a happy marriage is to have your own shed. And then, in the next breath, explain the principles of torque and gear ratios with surprising clarity. We discovered a shared enemy in the concept of the Homeowners Association. His HOA had once sent him a formal complaint about the un-American color of his prize-winning pumpkins. We were brothers in arms, fighting our own small wars against the forces of suburban beige. Finally, after 2 weeks of shrieking gearboxes, lumpy concrete, and murdered petunias, the day of the first test arrived. A steady 15-mile-per-hour wind was blowing. Perfect conditions. We had a new, much quieter, but still suspiciously cheap, gearbox from a decommissioned grain silo, and a generator that Gus swore was basically brand new, despite the visible rust spots. We connected the final wire. I held my breath. Gus gave me a thumbs up. The wind caught the sculpture's blades. They spun, feeding their silent, graceful energy into the clunky, utilitarian machinery below. The gearbox engaged with a satisfying, low clunk. For a second, nothing happened. Then the generator sputtered once, twice, and roared to life. It wasn't a quiet roar. It was a deep, guttural, two-stroke growl, the sound of pure, unrefined mechanical power. It wasn't the shriek of the golf cart gearbox, but it was far from the whisper I had advertised to Carol. It was the sound of a very determined, very loud lawnmower. And on our makeshift test bench, a single 60-watt light bulb flickered, then glowed with a steady, triumphant light. We had done it. We had created power. We had turned my beautiful, elegant art into a noisy, vibrating, gas-guzzling, just kidding, it was wind-powered, engine of glorious spite. I let out a whoop of pure joy. Gus just grinned, his mustache seeming to puff out with pride. It was a magnificent, deafening success. And from behind her living room curtains, he could see the telltale glint of a smartphone lens. Carol was gathering evidence. The war was about to escalate. The generator worked. My sculpture, my beautiful Zephyr's Whisper, was no longer just a piece of art. It was a power plant. A very small, very loud, but very functional power plant. Now came the crucial question: how to best deploy this newfound power for maximum psychological impact? I could power my TV, my refrigerator. I could trim a few bucks off my monthly electric bill. But where was the poetry in that? Where was the spectacle? My eyes landed on the calendar. It was October 15th. Halloween was just around the corner. Thanksgiving after that. And then, Christmas. a full 2.5 months away. It was, by any sane person's measure, far, far too early to even think about Christmas, which is precisely why it was perfect. The vision descended upon me in a flash of malicious inspiration. I wasn't just going to power something. I was going to power everything. I was going to mount an aesthetic assault on this neighborhood, the likes of which it had never seen. I was going to unleash the full, unrestrained spirit of Clark Griswold upon Maple Creek Estates, and I was going to do it before anyone had even bought their Thanksgiving turkey. And it would all be powered by the very metallic monstrosity Carol so despised. I laid out my battle plan for Gus over a celebratory beer that evening. His eyes lit up. "Oh, this is going to be good," he chuckled, stroking his mustache. "This is better than the time I helped a guy rig a catapult to launch water balloons at his neighbor's prize-winning poodles." The next Saturday was designated Operation Tacky Overload. We descended upon the local big-box stores like a two-man swarm of locusts with a credit card. We didn't just buy Christmas lights. We bought all the Christmas lights. Miles of them. Multicolored LEDs, classic incandescent bulbs that burned with the heat of 1,000 suns, strobing icicle lights, chaser lights that blinked in frantic, seizure-inducing patterns. We bought inflatable decorations, a 12-foot-tall Santa Claus with a vacantly cheerful expression, a whole herd of light-up reindeer, their heads designed to bob up and down in a creepy animatronic rhythm, a complete nativity scene, featuring a baby Jesus that glowed with an unnerving internal light, and a Star of Bethlehem that was, in reality, a repurposed disco ball. We bought extension cords, power strips, and timers. And for the pièce de résistance, Gus found a dusty box in the back of a hardware store containing a programmable sound system with 2 massive horn-shaped outdoor speakers, the kind they use at high school football games. The decoration process was an all-weekend affair. We were a whirlwind of staples, zip ties, and questionable ladder safety. We draped lights over every square inch of the house. We outlined the roof, the windows, the doors. We wrapped the tree in the front yard so tightly it looked like it was being strangled by a rainbow python. The inflatable snowman was strategically positioned so that, when fully inflated, it would completely block Carol's view of her award-winning rose bushes from her kitchen window. The herd of mechanical reindeer was arranged in a V formation on the lawn, aimed directly at her front door like a festive cavalry charge. And then, the final touch. Gus, who apparently had some experience in sign-making, helped me rig a massive light-up message on the peak of my roof. Using a string of brilliant white rope lights, we painstakingly spelled out the words, "Happy Holidays, powered by wind and spite." By Sunday evening, my house looked less like a home and more like a Las Vegas casino had crashed into a Toys R Us. It was glorious. It was hideous. It was perfect. All we needed now was the wind and an audience. I didn't have to wait long. Tuesday evening brought a brisk, steady wind, the kind of autumn blow that rustles all the leaves off the trees. It was showtime. I checked my watch, 6:15 p.m. Right around the time Carol usually got home from her weekly book club. I sat in my living room, the main breaker for the display, a massive comically oversized industrial lever we'd mounted on the side of the house for dramatic effect, within easy reach through the open window. The house was dark, the yard dormant. The generator was off. All was quiet. It was the calm before the storm. At 6:23, her silver SUV pulled into her driveway. The timing was impeccable. She got out of the car, juggling her purse and a tote bag, that presumably held a book she hadn't read, but had very strong opinions about. As she walked towards her front door, her eyes inevitably drifted over to my yard, her expression a mixture of confusion and disgust at the unilluminated plastic zoo I had assembled. She saw me sitting in the window. Our eyes met across the 30 feet of perfectly manicured turf that separated our properties. I gave her a polite little wave, a small, neighborly smile. Then, with all the dramatic flair I could muster, I reached out the window, grabbed the handle of the giant lever, and threw it down with a resounding ka-chunk. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The generator, now under a heavy load, roared to life with a throaty bellow that drowned out the wind. And then, the light. My entire property erupted in a blistering, retina-searing supernova of color. 20,000 LEDs and 500 incandescent bulbs blazed into existence, turning my quiet suburban lot into a beacon of pure, unadulterated tackiness. The 12-foot Santa inflated with a mighty whoosh, lurching to its full height. The reindeer heads began their creepy, rhythmic bobbing. The disco ball star of Bethlehem started spinning, casting frantic flecks of light across the entire street. And then came the sound. From the horn speakers, a slightly distorted, tinny rendition of Jingle Bell Rock blasted out. The volume cranked to just shy of causing structural damage. The slight waver in the music, caused by the generator's fluctuating output, only added to the manic, unhinged quality of the scene. I looked over at Carol. She was frozen mid-stride, her keys dangling from her hand. Her face was a perfect, beautiful mask of stunned, incandescent rage. Her mouth was slightly agape, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was the face of a woman who had just seen all the rules of civilized society spontaneously combust before her very eyes. The feud was no longer passive. The Cold War had just gone nuclear. It took exactly 53 minutes. I had a stopwatch running. 53 minutes from the moment I threw the switch to the moment the serene darkness of our street was violated by the strobing red and blue of police lights. A squad car pulled up, bathing the already flashing street in an even more urgent rhythm of light. 2 officers got out. One was older, with a weary, thick mustache and a slump to his shoulders that suggested he'd seen it all, and was profoundly tired of all of it. The other was young, barely out of the academy, with a bright, eager expression that was about to be cruelly extinguished by the realities of suburban policing. I met them at the door, turning the music down to a slightly less deafening level. "Evening, officers," I said calmly. "Evening, sir," the older one, whose name tag read Davies, said with a world-weary sigh. He gestured with his thumb over his shoulder. "Your neighbor seems to be concerned about your holiday decorations." I glanced past them. Carol was standing on her lawn, wrapped in a plush pink bathrobe, her arms crossed, pointing a trembling finger at my house. She looked like a witness identifying a suspect in a lineup of Christmas criminals. "Officer, thank God you're here," she called out, her voice shrill with indignation. "He's created a public nuisance. The noise, the lights, it's October." "My decorations?" I asked Officer Davies, feigning innocent confusion. I leaned casually against the doorframe, projecting an aura of complete and utter reasonability. "Officer, I'm just an American citizen getting into the holiday spirit a bit early this year. But more importantly," I said, lowering my voice conspiratorially, "I'm exploring off-grid, sustainable living. This entire display," I swept my arm out in a grand gesture, "is powered by my wind turbine. It's a green initiative for the planet." The younger officer, Miller, according to his tag, peered past me at the generator, then at the spinning sculpture. A look of genuine interest crossed his face. Wait, for real? That little sculpture thing powers all of this? That's actually pretty cool. Officer Davies shot him a look that could curdle milk. Miller, focus. He turned back to me. Sir, cool or not, we have a noise complaint. Of course, I said, nodding understandingly. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I disappeared back into the house for a second and returned with a small digital device. And I'm a law-abiding citizen, which is why I have my decibel meter right here. I took the liberty of looking up City Ordinance 113.8. Daytime noise levels in a residential area cannot exceed 60 decibels. As you can see, I held up the meter, the screen glowing with the number, 58.5. We are currently operating at a perfectly legal volume, and I fully intend to shut the whole system down at the 10 p.m. noise curfew as per the law. Officer Davies stared at the decibel meter. He stared at me. He stared at Carol, who was now practically vibrating with frustration. He let out another long, slow sigh. He was a man utterly defeated by malicious compliance. Ma'am, he called over to Carol. He's not breaking any laws. The noise is within the legal limit, and there's no ordinance about what time of year you can put up lights. But it's obnoxious, she sputtered. Obnoxious isn't illegal, Davies said, the weariness in his voice reaching its peak. This is a civil matter. You'll have to take it up with your homeowners association. He tipped his hat to me. Have a good night, sir. Try to keep the holiday spirit to a minimum. They walked back to their car, Officer Miller sneaking a last, impressed look at my setup and trying, unsuccessfully, to hide a grin. As they drove away, I looked at Carol. Her face was a thundercloud. I had won the battle. She had brought the law to my doorstep, and the law had shrugged and left. But I knew, with every fiber of my being, that she was now going to bring the HOA. And that was a war I might not win. The day after the police incident, a palpable tension settled over Maple Creek Estates. My house, now dark and silent during the day, was a looming monument to the previous night's chaos. The uninflated Santa lay slumped on the lawn like a casualty of war. The generator sat quietly behind its bush. But everyone knew that as soon as the wind picked up and evening fell, the circus would be back in town. The neighborhood, once a tranquil monolith of beige unity, began to fracture. You could feel it in the way people walked their dogs, the way they collected their mail. Alliances were being formed. Sides were being chosen. It was Team Frank versus Team Carol, and there was no middle ground. Team Carol consisted mostly of the older, original residents of the neighborhood. People who used phrases like property values and curb appeal with religious reverence. I'd see them conferring in hushed tones by their mailboxes, casting dark looks towards my house. Their whispers followed me when I went to get the paper. An absolute eyesore, I heard Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down mutter. And the noise, it's just not done. They were the keepers of the beige flame, and I was the heretic threatening to burn it all down with cheap, multicolored LEDs. Team Frank, however, was a surprisingly robust faction. It was made up of the younger families, the ones who were tired of the HOA's iron-fisted rule over trash can placement and lawn height. My most vocal supporter was Dave, a guy my age who lived across the street. The first night he had come over with a 6-pack of beer, pulled up a lawn chair, and just watched the light show with a look of pure, unadulterated glee. "This is the greatest thing that has ever happened on this street," he'd said, cracking open a beer. "You're a legend, man. A suburban folk hero." He became my de facto second-in-command, my source of neighborhood intel and drunken moral support. Other neighbors would give me a sly thumbs up when they drove by, or their kids would point at the house with wide, excited eyes. I was chaos, but for some, I was a welcome chaos. The war itself devolved into a series of petty, passive-aggressive skirmishes. The suburban Cold War had begun. Carol started mowing her lawn at exactly 7:00 a.m. every Saturday, the roar of her riding mower a clear shot across the bow. I responded by testing my generator at the same time, the two engines dueling for acoustic supremacy. My morning paper started mysteriously ending up in a puddle at the end of the driveway whenever the sprinklers ran. In response, her Amazon packages would somehow get nudged by my car's bumper, falling from her porch into a bush. Then the official letters started. Not from Carol anymore, but from the HOA on thick, creamy letterhead that smelled of money and authority. They were masterpieces of bureaucratic nitpicking. I received a violation notice because my recycling bin was visibly open from a street-facing vantage point. Another for a patch of non-uniform grass height near my driveway. A third, and this was my favorite, for the conspicuous display of a garden hose in a non-coiled state. Each one came with a threat of a fine. I paid them all with a smile, knowing that every $50 check was just fuel for the fire that would be the inevitable, final showdown. That showdown came, as I knew it would, in the form of a crisp, cream-colored envelope slipped under my door. It was a notice for an emergency meeting of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The agenda had only one item: Proposed Bylaw Amendment 11.7.b, Regulation of Private Power Generation Equipment. This was it. Carol's endgame. She couldn't beat me with the law, so she was going to make a new law. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, joyless room that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and shattered dreams. The air was thick with tension. The room was divided like a church at a contentious wedding. Team Carol, in their pastel sweaters and sensible shoes, sat on the right. Team Frank, a more motley crew in jeans and hoodies, sat on the left. Dave gave me a reassuring nod as I walked in. Carol, standing at a podium at the front of the room, was in her element. She had a binder. She had charts. She spoke about noise, pollution, aesthetic harmony, and the dangerous precedent of allowing residents to operate industrial machinery on their property. She made it sound like I was running a smelting plant on my front lawn. When it was my turn to speak, I was ready. I walked to the podium and plugged my laptop into the projector. A title slide appeared on the screen behind me. Maple Creek Estates, Powering the Future. I didn't talk about spite. I didn't talk about Carol or her cat. I talked about rising energy costs. I showed them charts of my reduced carbon footprint. I spoke with passion about American ingenuity, self-sufficiency, and the spirit of innovation. I reframed the entire project. This wasn't a tacky Christmas display born of a grudge. No, this was a pioneering step towards a green, self-sufficient suburban future. I was a visionary, not a nuisance. Some of the faces on Carol's side of the room began to look uncertain. I was speaking their language: money, efficiency, progress. Then, for my final witness, the back doors of the clubhouse opened. In walked Gus, still in his greasy overalls, wiping his hands on his rag. I had called him for technical support. "Folks," Gus began, leaning on the podium, his magnificent mustache quivering with sincerity. "I'm just a simple man. I fix things, and what Frank here has done, it's a beautiful thing. We spend all our time living in these perfect little boxes, with our perfect little lawns, scared to get our hands dirty. This man, he saw a problem, the wind, and he turned it into a solution. Is it a little loud? Maybe. Is it a little bright? Sure. But it's his. He built it. That's the American way, ain't it?" He was met with a smattering of applause from my side of the room. Dave stood up. "I, for one, think it's the most interesting thing to happen in this neighborhood in the 15 years I've lived here," he said loudly. "My kids love it. It's time we loosened up a little." Carol's face had gone from triumphant to thunderous. Her power base was eroding before her very eyes. The HOA president, a mild-mannered man named George, called for the vote. "All in favor of the proposed bylaw amendment to ban private power generation equipment." Hands went up on the right side of the room. I counted them. 12. All opposed. Hands went up on my side. Dave's shot up first. Then others. I counted them, my heart pounding. 15. The motion was defeated. A small cheer went up from my side. Carol stood frozen at the podium, her mouth a thin, hard line. She had been publicly beaten. She had swung her biggest club, the HOA, and she had missed. I was no longer just a neighborhood nuisance. I was a folk hero. A very loud, very bright, officially sanctioned folk hero. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was a quiet, cold victory. My light display continued to blaze nightly, the generator rumbling its legally sanctioned song. Carol was conspicuously silent. She no longer glared from her window. Instead, she simply pretended my entire property didn't exist. We had entered a new, icier phase of our Cold War. It felt like a permanent stalemate. I had won, but the victory felt hollow. The spite was getting exhausting. I was starting to run out of Christmas songs for the looping playlist, and it was still only November. I needed a new dynamic, an act of God, a deus ex machina to break the deadlock. And then, the weather report delivered. A storm was coming. Not just a storm, but the storm. The news channels called it a once-in-a-generation weather event. A megastorm barreling down on us with hurricane-force winds and torrential rain. They warned of widespread, prolonged power outages, while the rest of Maple Creek Estates was in a panic, buying up batteries and bottled water. I felt a thrill of pure, unadulterated excitement. This was it, the final exam, the ultimate stress test for the Zephyr's whisper and its noisy, mechanical heart. All my tinkering, all the noise, all the neighborhood drama, it had all been leading to this moment. Gus, naturally, saw it the same way. He showed up on my porch the evening the storm was due to hit, carrying a 6-pack of beer and a high-powered flashlight. "No way I'm missing this," he said, his eyes gleaming with the manic energy of a true chaos enthusiast. "This is her Super Bowl." We watched from the living room window as the sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple. The wind began to pick up, first as a whisper, then a moan, then a full-throated howl. The trees in my yard bent sideways, their branches flailing. Across the street, I could see Carol and her husband frantically trying to tape a sheet of plywood over a large picture window. My sculpture, my beautiful whisper, came alive like never before. It spun with a furious, impossible speed, a blur of polished steel against the darkening sky. And the generator. Oh, the generator. It roared. Hooked up to the full insane power of a gale-force wind, it wasn't just rumbling anymore. It sounded like a 747 was attempting to take off from my azalea bush. The lights on the house, fed by this massive surge of power, blazed with an almost painful intensity. The inflatable Santa looked like it was about to achieve orbit. Then, at 8:42 p.m., it happened. A brilliant blue-green flash lit up the sky a few blocks away, followed by a loud pop. A transformer had blown. In an instant, every light in Maple Creek Estates, every house, every street lamp went out. The entire neighborhood was plunged into a sudden, shocking, absolute darkness. Except for one house. My house. My house was an island. A glorious, garish, ridiculously over-the-top beacon of light in an ocean of black. The only things you could see for blocks were the frantic, blinking lights of my 10,000 tacky LEDs. And the only thing you could hear over the howling of the wind was the triumphant, distorted sound of Frosty the Snowman blasting from my horn speakers. It was beautiful. It was biblical. For a while, Gus and I just sat there in the blazing light, drinking our beers and laughing. It was the perfect, ridiculous climax to the whole stupid affair. But then, a strange thing started to happen. A small pinprick of light appeared across the street. A flashlight beam, bobbing its way towards my house. It was Dave. He knocked on the door, looking soaked and slightly sheepish. "Hey, man," he yelled over the generator and the storm. "This is gonna sound crazy, but my phone's at 2%. Any chance I could—" "Get in here," I shouted back, waving him inside. We plugged his phone into a power strip in the kitchen. A few minutes later, another knock. It was the young family from 2 doors down. Their baby's bottle warmer had no power. Then another knock. Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who had voted with Team Carroll, needed to power his nebulizer. One by one, like moths to a ridiculously bright flame, my neighbors started to emerge from the darkness. They came with phones, with laptops, with coffee makers, with medical devices. My house, the source of so much division and annoyance, had become a chaotic, brightly lit, jingle bell, rock-fueled community center. Gus, in his element, became the master of ceremonies, directing traffic and finding open outlets on the myriad of power strips we had running. "Okay, the nativity scene is running off this one, so you got 3 open spots here," he'd yell. It was absurd. It was wonderful. And then there was one last knock on the door. A quiet, hesitant rap that was almost lost in the noise. I opened it. It was Carol. She stood on my porch, soaked and shivering, holding a small, portable medical-grade refrigerator in one hand and a dead flashlight in the other. Her hair was a mess. Her face, illuminated by the insane blinking of 1,000 lights, was stripped of all its usual condescending superiority. She just looked tired. Defeated. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the welcome mat. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the wind and the music. "His insulin. It needs to stay refrigerated. The backup battery on the fridge is dead." The entire, absurd history of our feud flashed through my mind. The letter, the gearbox, the HOA meeting. Here she was, my nemesis. The source of it all, standing on my doorstep, asking for my help. I had all the power, literally and figuratively. I could have been a jerk. I could have savored the moment, made her beg. But looking at her, standing there in the raging storm, all the spite just evaporated. It felt pointless. The game was over. I stood there for a long, dramatic pause. She finally looked up, her eyes bracing for my rejection. "Gus?" I called over my shoulder. "Find her an outlet. The one by the inflatable Grinch should be free." A flicker of disbelief, then profound relief, washed over Carol's face. Gus led her inside, found a spot for the small fridge, and plugged it in. Its little green power light blinked on. "Thank you, Frank," she said quietly, still not quite looking at me. "Don't mention it, Carol," I replied. The power was out for 2 full days. My generator was a hero. When the utility trucks finally rolled down our street and the lights came back on with a collective cheer, the feud felt like a distant memory. The storm had washed it all away. A week later, I was in my front yard. It was a crisp, clear autumn day. The Christmas decorations were gone, packed away until a more appropriate time. I was building a small, insulated wooden housing for the generator, something to dampen the sound. The sculpture, my whisper, spun lazily in the gentle breeze, silent once again. I saw Carol in her yard, tending to the rose bushes the snowman had once obscured. She looked over. I braced myself for a comment, a complaint. "That's a good idea," she said, nodding towards the housing I was building. "A sound buffer. The whirring from that gearbox was always much more pleasant than the generator's roar." I stopped hammering and looked at her, surprised. "Yeah, well," I said, a small grin forming on my face. "Don't want to distress Bartholomew." For the first time since I'd met her, I saw the corner of Carol Peterson's mouth twitch upwards in what might have been, in a different dimension, the beginning of a smile. It wasn't friendship. It would never be friendship. But it was a truce. A peace treaty signed in the aftermath of a ridiculous, light-blasted, wind-powered war. My sculpture turned silently on my lawn, a monument to a battle well fought and absurdly won. I picked up my hammer and thought to myself, "Now, about those solar panels for the roof."